They made you laugh every week. They were in your living room on schedule, familiar as a neighbor, dependable as clockwork. Their faces were on the cover of TV Guide. Their catchphrases became part of American conversation. And behind all of it, some of them were broke. Not after the show ended, not after one bad decision. During, before, and long after the cameras moved on. The Screen Actors Guild minimum wage in the 1950s was $75 a day for extras. Supporting players on early network shows earned a few $100s per episode. Residuals, the lifeblood of any working actor, barely existed until SAG fought hard for them through the 1960s. By then, some of the most beloved faces in American television had already spent years working for whatever the studios were willing to offer, which was never much. What follows are 20 sitcom stars who spent their careers fighting a financial reality that the audience never saw. Some died broke. Some lived in apartments smaller than the sets where they played wealthy characters. Some had SAG membership cards but no grocery money. The laugh tracks kept rolling. The poverty was quiet. If you want more deep dives into what was really happening behind the sitcoms you grew up watching, hit subscribe. We go places that TV Guide never did. 1. Phil Silvers. Phil Silvers played Sergeant Ernie Bilko on The Phil Silvers Show, which ran on CBS from 1955 to 1959. The character was a con artist, a schemer, a man who could talk his way into and out of anything, and Silvers played him with such precision and speed that the show won Emmy Awards in each of its 4 seasons. Bilko was, in every scene, a man obsessed with getting more money. The irony was almost brutal. Silvers was a compulsive gambler. He gambled on everything: sports, cards, horses, anything with odds and a payout. Through the run of the show, he was one of the most celebrated comedians in America, and he was losing money as fast as CBS was paying it to him. His gambling debts mounted through the 1960s as his career slowed. When his marriage to Jo Carol Dennison collapsed in 1960, the financial picture got worse. By the early 1970s, Silvers suffered a series of strokes that affected his speech. He kept working, appearing in small roles throughout the decade, but the money was long gone. He lived his final years in a modest apartment in Century City, California. When he died in November 1985 at age 73, the estate left behind bore no resemblance to the earnings of a 4-time Emmy winner. The man who spent 4 seasons playing the greatest con artist in television history had been conned by his own habits for 30 years. The audience never had any idea. 2. Shecky Green. Shecky Green was never the star of a single defining sitcom, but for 20 years he was one of the most reliable supporting and guest presences in American television comedy. Appearing on everything from variety hours to sitcom pilots from the late 1950s through the 1970s. In Las Vegas, he was a headliner. On television, he was the kind of comic who kept working because he was genuinely gifted and the industry knew it. Green's problem was the same as Silver's. Gambling, Las Vegas residencies paid well. But Vegas also offered him the casino floor 20 minutes after his last set. He acknowledged in interviews that he lost enormous sums over his career, sums that would have set him up permanently if they had stayed in his pocket. He also battled alcoholism, which cost him bookings, damaged relationships, and ate into whatever financial ground he managed to recover. Late in his life, Green was living quietly in Nevada, doing occasional interviews and telling stories, but the wealth that his decades of work should have produced was not there. His career never translated into the financial security that viewers would have assumed for someone so consistently employed. Another working comic who worked his whole life and died without much to show for it. 3. Gary Coleman. Gary Coleman played Arnold Jackson on Different Strokes, which ran on NBC from 1978 to 1986. The show made him the most recognizable child actor in America. His delivery of the line, "What you talkin' about, Willis?" became one of the most quoted catchphrases in the history of American television. At his peak, Coleman was earning $100,000 per episode, a number that should have meant lifelong financial security. It did not. His parents, Willie and Sue Coleman, along with their business manager, had been drawing from his earnings throughout the run of the show. In 1989, Coleman filed a lawsuit against his parents and manager, alleging mismanagement of the roughly $18 million he had earned as a child actor. The court settlement awarded him approximately $1.28 million, a fraction. He would later say he received even less than that after legal fees. Coleman spent the rest of his life working. He worked as a security guard. He appeared in celebrity boxing matches. He took part in reality television. In 2008, he filed for bankruptcy. He died in May 2010 at age 42 following a brain hemorrhage. His estate was valued at around $75,000. The most famous child star of the 1970s died without enough money to cover a year of rent in the city where he made his career. 4. Bob Denver. Bob Denver played two of the most beloved comedic characters in the history of American television. He was Maynard G. Krebs, the beatnik sidekick on The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, which ran on CBS from 1959 to 1963. Then he was Gilligan, the first billed castaway on Gilligan's Island, which ran on CBS from 1964 to 1967. In reruns, Gilligan's Island has been in continuous circulation for over 5 decades, seen by multiple generations of American children growing up in households where syndication played all afternoon. Denver saw almost none of the money generated by those reruns. The residual structure for syndicated television in the 1960s was rudimentary. CBS and the producers reaped the licensing fees. Denver earned what he was paid per episode and very little after. He spent years doing convention appearances, personal tours as Gilligan, and small television work. Not because he wanted to, but because the work was how he paid his bills. In 2004, Denver disclosed that he had been diagnosed with cancer. He died in September 2005 at age 70 in North Carolina. The show that bearing his face in syndication for 4 decades had not made him a wealthy man. He said so plainly in his later interviews, with no bitterness, but complete honesty. The residual system that failed him was later reformed, partly because of cases exactly like his. 5. Charlotte Rae. Charlotte Rae played Edna Garrett, house mother and cook, first on Different Strokes from 1978, and then for 7 seasons on The Facts of Life, which ran on NBC from 1979 to 1988. Mrs. Garrett was warm, stable, principled, the moral anchor of the show. And Rae brought genuine depth to a character that another actress might have played as mere background furniture. She received Emmy nominations. She was a cornerstone of NBC's primetime lineup through the Reagan era. What most viewers did not know was that Rae had left The Facts of Life in 1986, partly because of financial disagreements with the production. Behind the domestic comfort of the Eastland School, her own finances were complicated by a divorce from composer John Strauss, which she described as financially devastating. She had a son, Andy, with significant special needs, and the cost of his care was a constant and serious financial pressure throughout her working years and afterward. Rae continued working into her 80s out of genuine necessity as much as love of the craft. She was open about this in her 2015 memoir, The Facts of My Life. She died in August 2018 at age 92. She was one of the kindest women in television. She was also a woman who worked her entire life, partly because she had to, a truth that did not fit the comforting image of Mrs. garret that 30 years of reruns had built. 6. Tom Poston. Tom Poston had one of the most quietly successful careers in American television comedy. He was a regular on The Steve Allen Show in the late 1950s. He won an Emmy in 1959 for his work there. He played Franklin Delano Bickley, the irascible neighbor on Mork and Mindy, which ran on ABC from 1978 to 1982. He appeared on Newhart, on Bob, and on dozens of other programs across 5 decades. He worked constantly. But working constantly as a character actor and supporting player in television has never meant earning well. The pay scale for supporting roles was governed by SAG minimums and individual negotiation, and character actors, however gifted, have historically had less leverage than series leads. Poston was married 3 times, with the attendant financial costs of those separations. He later married actress Suzanne Plachette in 2001, and his final years were more comfortable than many that preceded them. But colleagues who knew him through the middle decades of his career recall a man who was constantly looking for the next booking. Not because he loved the hustle, but because the financial cushion was never there. He died in April 2007 at age 85. His career was 50 years of steady, respected work. The financial reward was almost entirely out of proportion to the talent he delivered. 7. Jean Stapleton. Jean Stapleton played Edith Bunker on All in the Family, which ran on CBS from 1971 to 1979. The show changed American television. It brought race, class, the women's movement, Vietnam, and the sexual revolution into the living room in a way that the 3 network era had never attempted. Stapleton's Edith was the quiet moral center of all of it. A woman who loved a man who constantly failed her and who met every human being she encountered with uncomplicated decency. She won 3 Emmy Awards for the role. Stapleton made a decision in the late 1970s that most actors are not in a financial position to make freely. She chose to leave the show, feeling Edith's story had been told. The decision was principled and right artistically, but her departure from one of the highest-rated programs in television history. At a time when network television salaries were finally becoming significant, cost her financially. She spent the following decades doing theater, which she loved and which pays modestly, and television work that respected her talent but did not approach the scale of All in the Family. Her husband, William Putch, a theater director, died in 1983, leaving her without that partnership. She died in June 2013 at age 90. Her contribution to American culture was immeasurable. The financial reward for it was considerably less than she deserved. 8. Pat Morita. Pat Morita played Arnold Takahashi, the proprietor of Arnold's Drive-In on Happy Days, appearing on the show from 1975 to 1983, a tenure that made him a beloved figure in 1970s American television. He was also later Mr. Miyagi in the Karate Kid films, a role that earned him an Academy Award nomination in 1985. He was one of the most recognizable Asian American faces in the history of Hollywood. What the audience did not see was that Morita spent much of his early life in poverty with a specific cruelty attached to it. During World War II, he was hospitalized with spinal tuberculosis as a child, and when he was released from the hospital, he was sent directly to a Japanese-American internment camp in Arizona rather than back to his family. He arrived at the camp while still in his hospital gown. He was 11 years old. The psychological and material damage of that experience shaped everything that followed. His rise to fame was hard-won against a Hollywood that had limited roles for Asian American actors and significant structural barriers to advancement. He battled alcoholism through much of his career, a struggle he tied directly to the trauma of his childhood. He died in November 2005 at age 73, having lived a life of remarkable accomplishment that included forms of suffering most of his audience never thought to ask about. 9. Doodles Weaver. Doodles Weaver was a comedic performer who appeared regularly on television throughout the 1950s and 1960s, including on the Colgate Comedy Hour and in various sitcom guest appearances. He was the kind of rubber-faced physical comedian that the early variety television era relied on, a utility player of American comedy whose name was familiar to anyone watching NBC in the Eisenhower years. Weaver's career followed a trajectory that was common to performers who rose during the variety television boom of the early 1950s and found themselves stranded when the format collapsed by the end of the decade. The variety show was replaced by the filmed sitcom, which required different skills and different relationships with different producers. Weaver found work where he could, but the reliable income of his peak years did not survive the format change. His personal life was marked by instability and financial strain. He died in January 1983 at age 71 by suicide at his home in Burbank. His sister was the actress Sigrid Guri. He had spent the final years of his life in difficult circumstances. The name Doodles Weaver is remembered now only by scholars of early television comedy. In his era, he made America laugh. That was worth very little when the era ended. 10. Isabelle Sanford. Isabelle Sanford played Louise Jefferson on All in the Family beginning in 1971, and then as the co-lead on The Jeffersons, which ran on CBS from 1975 to 1985. The Jeffersons was built around the premise of a black family that had achieved genuine prosperity, moving on up, as the theme song announced, to a deluxe apartment on the East Side. Sanford played a woman who had made it, who wore her success with dignity and occasional delight. The gap between that character and Sanford's actual financial situation through much of her career was significant. She had spent years in theater before television, working for very little money in a field where black performers faced explicit systemic exclusion from leading roles and from the economic structures that turned stage success into financial security. Her ascent to the Jeffersons came relatively late in her career. She was in her mid-40s when the show launched. Even with a decade of one of CBS's most successful sitcoms behind her, Sanford continued working consistently after the show ended because she needed to. She was the first black woman to win an Emmy Award in the lead comedy actress category, taking it in 1981. The Emmy came. The financial stability that American audiences assumed the show's success had delivered was more complicated. She died in July 2004 at age 86. She had given Louise Jefferson a life of ease. Her own was harder. Before we continue, take a second and hit subscribe if you are watching this and haven't already. We are halfway through, and the stories only get harder from here. 11. Jimmy Walker. Jimmy Walker played J.J. Evans on Good Times, which ran on CBS from 1974 to 1979. The Evans family lived in a Cabrini Green housing project in Chicago. The show was one of the first American sitcoms to center a working-class black family living in genuine urban poverty, and for its first 2 seasons, it was pointed, intelligent, and uncomfortable in the way that mattered. JJ's Dynamite became the catchphrase of the mid-1970s. Walker was on every magazine cover. He was an American pop culture phenomenon. The money that should have followed did not stay. Walker has been remarkably open in interviews about the financial reality of his career after Good Times. He has described making very large sums and having very little to show for it, a function of the spending habits of young, suddenly wealthy performers who had no financial infrastructure around them. No manager who prioritized their long-term security. He also acknowledged being difficult to cast after the show because the industry could only see J.J. Walker spent decades doing stand-up on the club circuit, one of the most grueling and least lucrative long-term careers in American entertainment. He has said plainly that he works because he has to. He is in his late 70s now. He is still booking dates, The man who spent 5 years playing a character meant to represent the face of American urban poverty was never very far from financial pressure himself. 12. Dick Van Patten. Dick Van Patten played Tom Bradford, the patriarch of the Bradford household on 8 is Enough, which ran on ABC from 1977 to 1981. Tom Bradford was a steady, warm father figure raising 8 children in Sacramento, the kind of reassuring presence that ABC's primetime wanted in the late 1970s. Van Patten had been a working actor since childhood, with credits going back to Broadway in the 1940s and early television in the 1950s. What few people knew was that Van Patten spent significant portions of his career in genuine financial difficulty. He has spoken in interviews about periods before 8 is Enough when the family was stretched thin, when he was taking any role available to keep the household running. 8 children, even in a fictional household, require real money in the actual one. He was supporting a family on the kind of income that character actors and supporting players generated before the salary landscape of network television shifted in the late 1970s. After 8 is Enough, Van Patten remained busy with guest appearances and smaller roles, and he founded a pet food company, Natural Balance Pet Foods, which became genuinely successful and provided the financial security his acting career alone had not. He died in June 2015 at age 86. The dog food company did more for his retirement than 4 seasons of primetime television. 13. Nancy Culp. Nancy Culp played Miss Jane Hathaway, the prim bird-watching secretary at the Commerce Bank of Beverly Hills on the Beverly Hillbillies, which ran on CBS from 1962 to 1971. The show was one of the highest-rated programs in television history, regularly topping the Nielsen charts through the mid-1960s. Culp's Miss Hathaway was part of what made it work, a genuinely comic performance inside a show that critics dismissed and audiences adored. Culp received 1 Emmy nomination for the role. What she received in compensation was governed by the standard arrangements for supporting cast in 1960s network television, which meant that the show's producers and CBS profited enormously, while the supporting actors earned modest per-episode fees and limited residuals from what would become one of the most syndicated shows in American television history. After the show ended, Culp sought a career in politics, running unsuccessfully as a Democratic candidate for Congress from Pennsylvania in 1984. The man who had played Jed Clampett, Buddy Ebsen, publicly endorsed her opponent during the race. The betrayal was real and professionally damaging. Culp died in February 1991 at age 69. She never achieved financial comfort proportional to her decade on one of the most watched shows in the history of American network television. 14. Herby Fay. Herby Fay played Private Fender on The Phil Silvers Show alongside Phil Silvers from 1955 to 1959, appearing in all 143 episodes of one of the sharpest sitcoms in the history of CBS. He was a small man with an expressive face and a gift for reaction comedy, the kind of performer who made the star look better by being genuinely funny in the margins of every scene. The show was critically celebrated. Fay was part of what made it work. Supporting players in filmed sitcoms of the 1950s were paid flat fees per episode under SAG contracts that provided little residual protection. When The Phil Silvers Show went into syndication, as it did extensively, Fay saw essentially none of those returns. He continued working through the 1960s and 1970s, appearing in television films and guest spots, the kind of career that keeps a working actor employed, but never wealthy. Fay died in June 1980 at age 72. His name is not remembered by most people who can still quote dialogue from the show he spent 4 years making. That anonymity is part of the story. The supporting players of early television built shows that ran in syndication for generations. Very few of them were paid for it. 15. Estelle Getty. Estelle Getty played Sophia Petrillo, Dorothy's sharp-tongued. Sicily-born mother on The Golden Girls, which ran on NBC from 1985 to 1992. Sophia became one of the great comic characters in the history of American television. Getty was 79 years old when she began playing a character listed as 80-year-old, a fact that still surprises people. The timing was unusual because Getty had spent most of her career working in theater and small television roles for very modest pay. Before The Golden Girls, Getty had been a working actress for decades with no particular financial security to show for it. She had supported herself and her family through the lean years the way most theater actors do. By working constantly and spending carefully and hoping for the break that didn't come for a very long time. She was in her mid-60s before she had a reliable income from her craft. Getty suffered from what was eventually diagnosed as Lewy body dementia, and the disease progressed during and after the final seasons of The Golden Girls. By the late 1990s, she required significant care. She died in July 2008 at age 84. Her 7 years on The Golden Girls were her financial security. Everything before was decades of work that left almost no cushion. She was 62 years old the first time she didn't have to wonder how the bills would be covered. 16. Scatman Crothers. Scatman Crothers was one of the most endlessly employed performers in mid-20th century American entertainment. He played Louie the Garbage Man on Chico and the Man, which ran on NBC from 1974 to 1978. He appeared in films, in television movies, in animated series as the voice of Hong Kong Phooey on ABC in 1974, and in dozens of television guest spots going back to the early 1950s. He also performed as a jazz musician throughout his life. Crothers worked in the era when black performers in American entertainment faced explicit exclusion from leading roles, from certain clubs and venues, and from the economic structures that generated lasting wealth for white counterparts. He was never a series lead. He was always the supporting player, the character actor, the voice, the jazz man who could be booked at lower rates than the names above the title. His talent was not in question. His access to the money that talent generated was severely limited by the structure of the industry he worked in. Crothers died in November 1986 at age 76 from lung cancer. He had worked in American entertainment for 50 years. He was beloved by colleagues and audiences alike. He did not leave behind wealth proportional to that work. He was one of hundreds of black performers of his generation for whom the economic reality of a segregated entertainment industry meant that talent and industry produced comfort at best, not security. 17. Ken Berry. Berry was a consistent, dependable television presence for 3 decades. He was also, by his own account, not well served by the financial arrangements that governed his career. He has spoken about the lack of residuals on shows like F Troop, which ran extensively in syndication with very little flowing back to the performers. He was also a generous man who, by his own account, was not careful enough with the money he did earn. He spent his later years in Woodland Hills, California, working occasionally in small roles and living quietly. His career was a consistent 30 years of solid television work. The financial return on 3 decades of being a recognizable face in American living rooms was, as with so many performers of his era, far less than the work warranted. He died in December 2018 at age 85. He deserved better from the system than he got. 18. Thelma Hopkins. Thelma Hopkins played Rachel Thomas on Gimme a Break, which ran on NBC from 1981 to 1987, and then Dawn Doris on Family Matters, which ran on ABC-CBS from 1989 to 1998. She was also 1/3 of the R&B vocal group Tony, Orlando, and Dawn, which had major commercial success in the early 1970s. She had, by any measure, a career that crossed multiple entertainment disciplines successfully. The problem with careers that cross multiple disciplines is that they rarely generate deep financial roots in any one of them. The recording industry of the early 1970s, particularly for black artists in the pop-soul crossover space, was structured to extract maximum value from performers while minimizing their share of the returns. The publishing rights, the back catalog ownership, the royalty structures that would have provided income for decades were typically retained by labels and managers. Hopkins has spoken candidly in interviews about financial struggles that have persisted through her career. She has been open about the gap between what she contributed to recordings and television programs and what she received for it. Her career is still active, still performing, still working at an age when most people have retired. Whether that is entirely by choice is a question she has answered more directly than most people in her position would. 19. Pat Buttram. Pat Buttram played Mr. Haney, the fast-talking conman and merchant who sold Oliver Douglas increasingly impractical items on Green Acres, which ran on CBS from 1965 to 1971. Buttram had a voice like a rusted hinge and a delivery that was as precise as any comedian working in American television in the 1960s. Mr. Haney was the kind of supporting character who steals every scene he appears in while making the show's premise work. Buttram spent his career as a supporting player and character actor, never the lead, always the scene stealer. He was the voice of the cowardly Sheriff of Nottingham in Disney's Robin Hood and appeared in dozens of television programs through the 1970s and 1980s. He was also, for many years, the president of the Gene Autry Western Heritage Museum in Los Angeles, a position that reflected his long association with Autry going back to the radio era. But the museum position was a labor of passion, not a significant income source. Buttram's financial situation through much of his later career was modest by any Hollywood standard. He died in January 1994 at age 78. He was one of the funniest supporting players in the history of the CBS rural comedy block, a body of work that played in syndication for 30 years. The financial residue of all those reruns was not in his bank account. 20. Bonnie Franklin. Bonnie Franklin played Ann Romano on One Day at a Time, which ran on CBS from 1975 to 1984. Ann Romano was a divorced mother of two raising her daughters in Indianapolis, working as an advertising account executive, and navigating a world that the women's movement had opened up without yet fully explaining. The show was one of the first American sitcoms to center a divorced woman as the protagonist, and it treated her experience with genuine respect. Franklin played her for 9 seasons. Franklin had come up through musical theater before landing the role, a background that was spiritually rich and financially thin. 9 seasons on a CBS show that regularly competed in the Nielsen Top 30 should have provided lasting comfort. The reality was more complicated. Franklin was vocal in interviews about the financial arrangements for women in television, about the pay disparities that persisted even for leads of successful shows, about the way that women who made it were paid less than their male counterparts in comparable positions. After the show ended, Franklin returned to theater, which she loved, and which paid accordingly. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2012 and died in March 2013 at age 69. She had spent 9 years as the face of one of the most culturally significant sitcoms of the 1970s, a show that told divorced women across America that their lives were worth watching. She deserved financial security that fully matched what she gave to it. She did not have it. 20 performers, 20 careers built on talent that American audiences trusted and loved and scheduled their evenings around. The Screen Actors Guild fought for decades to build the residual structures that now provide some financial protection for working actors. But for the performers who worked before those protections existed, or who were excluded from them by race or by the specific structure of their contracts, or who earned well and had no one helping them keep it, the math at the end of a career was often quietly devastating. The laugh track never acknowledged it. Neither did the reruns. These were real people living real financial lives behind the characters that millions of Americans invited into their homes every week. That gap between what the audience assumed and what was actually happening is the part of the story that television has never been good at telling. Which of these stories surprised you most? Leave it in the comments. And if you want to keep going deeper into what was really happening behind the shows you grew up watching, subscribe.